Unlike Static, Hardware was a character that I had never really heard of going into the Milestone books. I'm fairly confident that I had seen issues of his original volume in dollar bins and back issue bins when I was a kid, but I didn't have enough context to know exactly what I was looking at. The comics didn't say Marvel on the corner, so it's not like I was planning on buying them, nor did it say DC Comics either, so it's not like I had to actively hate it back when I was a kid. I just kept on moving. This puts me in a pretty good place for testing out this particular volume. When reading Static, I couldn't help but compare it to the cartoon, which made me wonder how the comic stacked up against its original version. With nothing to compare Hardware to, my job becomes a little bit easier. All I need to know is whether these particular comics are any good at all. Having now read all of Static Season 1, I am pleased with how Milestone has set up its books. I like the basic idea that we saw back in Milestone Returns. Brilliant scientist Curtis Metcalf, working for the multi-million-dollar company Alpha Industries, created the tear gas that caused extreme mutations in Black Lives Matter protesters. Curtis was against its use, but Alva sold the gas anyway. Now Curtis is the public scapegoat for that disaster. The police have already begun hunting him down, following him to his hidden lab. There he puts on as much experimental hardware as he can in order to defend himself. He's managed to scare off the first squad of police, but they aren't done with him yet. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 22.3, Hunting Hardware. Despite all of this, we actually open our first issue in a flashback. Young Curtis Metcalf sits on the shoulders of his father. He's brought Curtis out to protest the death of a young black man. We aren't told who, although my initial guess would be that they are protesting the death of Emmett Till. Till was a 14-year-old boy who was abducted, tortured, and killed by lynching in 1955 for offending a white woman in a grocery store. If that was the case, then Curtis is about 70 in the modern time period of Milestone, and that definitely is not the case. However, if this comic was set in 1993, which is when Hardware originally debuted, that would put Curtis in his 40s, and I could see that being the case. Updating Hardware to the contemporary times makes that move impossible, so whose death are they protesting in this scene? Unfortunately, there are far too many real-world options for who that could be. That is, in fact, the point of it. Curtis's mind returns to the modern time period and reviews his own situation, the gas released on the protesters, the horrible mutations, and how all of it is his fault, according to the press, according to the company that he has devoted his life to, and according to the authorities. He wanted those mutations to happen, they say, because he is a madman. No matter how much they have fought for equality, for consideration, no matter how much progress that has been made, the world always seems to push back. An armored vehicle smashes through the wall. Cops pour out from it, shouting for Metcalf to surrender. Hardware defends himself with a non-portable force field, blocking their fire. And then he blows up the lab. Yes, that did escalate quickly, if you're thinking it. But Curtis survives and jetpacks away. As he escapes, he faces a few helicopters, downs 2 of them, is downed by a third, and then blacks out. While he is out, we jump over to Edwin Alva, Curtis's former boss and father figure. The FBI is with him, informing Alva that they have evidence that Metcalf knew about the gas and its effects. They have evidence that he hid it from Alva, and it was actually the one responsible for shipping it out, going back months. Don't even worry about it. Alva states that he has a hard time believing that. He practically raised Curtis. He can't believe that he would really do all of this. But the officer says that people snap all the time, especially guys like him. Alva then starts to go all philosophical, diving into his history with Curtis through an interior monologue. When Curtis was a young man, just a kid, really, Alva discovered him at a local science fair. He took Metcalf under his wing, made sure that he got the best education possible, made sure that his mind was sharp as a knife. When Metcalf came to work for him, he had 6 degrees and a powerful sense of loyalty. They spent the next decade plus working together. Metcalf was the golden goose that Alva wanted him to be, but unfortunately, it didn't last. Not too long ago, Metcalf realized how much money Alva Industries had made off of his mind, and he wanted a bigger piece of the reward. We aren't told how much he asked for, but according to Alva, even asking for it was an affront. He didn't deserve those rewards. Everything that he had, everything that Curtis Metcalf was because of Edwin Alva. When the Big Bang happened, it just became the perfect excuse to get rid of him. We cut back to Hardware, who was awakened by his suit's AI program called POP, or POP. He's groggy and beaten up, but he manages to cobble together a solution to take down that last helicopter. He then settles down on the roof of a building next to Alva Industries. He deploys a portable speaker device, referred to as a pulse, which latches onto a window of Alva's office. Through it, they can talk. This scene then sets up the promise of what the book is going to be. Alva is going to be unrepentant for what he has done to Curtis. After all, he's the one who made Curtis matter in the first place. He is inarguably our bad guy, unwilling to change, unwilling to see reason, and unwilling to reach any kind of agreement with the man that he almost considers his son. With reason out the window, Curtis is going to be forced to fight for what's his cleared name, his inventions, and his freedom. He could just kill Alva, right here and right now. But that wouldn't fix his situation, nor would it make him pay. Curtis wants Alva to suffer. He wants him to see his empire burn. Hardware activates an additional feature on the pulse. Its volume skyrockets and shatters all of the glass surrounding Alva. Hardware flies into the office. When this is all over, he says, and everything that you care about is gone, then we'll see who made who. And then he flies off. Unlike Static, which retrod a lot of ground that Milestone Returns already covered, Hardware feels really fresh by comparison. Yes, what we saw in Returns still happened, but this comic doesn't waste our time doing all of that again like Static did. We are still given the basics. We know Metcalf's background a little bit more. We know his relationship to Alva and Alva Industries. We know that he's getting screwed over, and he's put on the hardware to be able to fight back. That all works, and author Brandon Thomas does a good job pacing this issue out. The opening scene with the cops demonstrates a number of Hardware's capabilities. We learn that his suit has an AI that manages most of the suit's functions. He does not have a portable force field. He was not able to miniaturize it to fit in the suit in time. In his arsenal, he also has a plasma knife, capable of appearing from the right gauntlet, a plasma whip, which also seems to, pop out of the gauntlet somehow, a jetpack, which can be controlled remotely by the POP AI, and the pulse device. That's a pretty good set of abilities and weapons when in the field. Despite handling the cops at his lab and downing 2 of the helicopters, though, Hardware does not feel unstoppable to me. When I read an Iron Man comic, I kind of have a hard time believing that anything can actually stop Iron Man, right? His suits are so advanced that they can do almost anything he wants them to. But here we see that Curtis couldn't miniaturize the force field generator, leaving him relatively unprotected, while also demonstrating that he can't do whatever he wants. His weapons are all hand-to-hand ones. Notice none of them are projectiles. Because honestly, he could only keep so much ammo in the suit itself, and eventually, even that would need replacing. At one point, Hardware's jetpack actually gets shot off of his back, demonstrating his relative vulnerability. He isn't an unstoppable armored killing machine like Iron Man or War Machine. He's a dude in a cobbled-together suit, and it feels like that, adding a sense of realism and threat to the book. The portion with Alva is important because, obviously, we want a bad guy worth taking down. Unlike Static, who was facing many problems all at once, Curtis's problems all stem from one source: the decisions made by Edwin Alva. Alva looks at Curtis and sees something that he has built. He paid for Curtis's education, he provided a stable job, and he has allowed Curtis to move on from the poverty-stricken life that he had as a child. As far as Alva is concerned, he doesn't owe Curtis anything. He has been well compensated for his work, and that's what he gets. Clearly, Curtis didn't agree. While I do find Alva a worthy villain, I am super duper confused as to the whole background situation regarding his guilt. The Returns one-shot established that Curtis suspected Alva of spying on him, and now we know that Curtis asked for fair compensation and Alva turned him down, so I would argue that suspicion makes some degree of sense. Alva shot him down, and Curtis started to watch his back going forward, which is how he found the bugs, which is why he created a secret lab, which is why he has all the hidden technology that he's going to be using as hardware to fight back. But when Alva is talking to the FBI tells Alva that they have proof of Metcalf's guilt. At first, it sounds like this moment is confirming that Alva and the FBI, or, at the very least, this particular agent, we're not really shown the whole organization, are working in concert in order to discredit Metcalf and salvage Alva's name. That makes sense to me. That feels like what we were shown in Milestone Returns. But then, Alva protests the evidence that the FBI has found, meaning that they aren't in cahoots? So which is it? Is this manufactured evidence that the FBI is planting in order to prove that Metcalf is guilty and Alva is in on it? Is this some kind of public performance that Alva is putting on? Because if so, it doesn't look like there's anybody else in the room. I don't understand why he would be doing that. And is the FBI the group investigating what's gone on here? Is that who has been attacking hardware? The armored gents look pretty much like the same ones that policed the protest, who we are being told were the Dakota PD. That just adds to the confusion as to who is pursuing Curtis and the lengths that they can go. I find it a bit hard to believe that the Dakota PD can use attack helicopters within city limits, but I'm also not sure that the FBI have that kind of power either. We also see Alva ordering both of those forces around, so what, they also answer to him? If anything, I feel like this part of the story should have two villains working in concert. We should have a leading FBI investigator who is in cahoots with Alva, who is coordinating the manhunt, and then we would have Alva himself as the final boss kind of thing working in the shadows. Right now, I feel like if you think about what is going on at all, it's all a big mess, and quite frankly, the story falls apart a little bit. Dennis Cowan returns to pencil this series. He was the original artist on Hardware's first comic, and he is inked by the legendary Bill Sienkiewicz, and colored by Chris Sotomayor. I'm unfamiliar with Cowan's work. Again, I never read the OG Hardware comic. But Sienkiewicz is a name that I know. He drew perhaps the most notable era of New Mutants Volume 1 with author Chris Claremont, and is famous for having dark, moody, and experimental art. Given that he is not the one doing the original line work, we don't really get to see a lot of that experimental side of Sienkiewicz here. Cowan's pages are all boxes and rectangles, your standard comic fare for the most part. He does seem to favor a nice, wide, horizontal panel, oftentimes cutting the page up with 5 or 6 rectangles that are just stacked one on top of the other. This does limit the camera angles that he uses, and can make for some very confusing combat scenes. When Hardware uses his plasma whip, for example, it took me a little bit of time to figure out that he used the whip to grab a missile that was fired at him and flew past. He grabs it, and then he spins around one time and redirects the missile, slamming it into the helicopter. That action makes sense, and in a movie, it really would flow well, and I'm sure it would look cool, but holy hell was it a little bit more difficult to figure out in the comic. Later on, when Hardware downs the final helicopter, he disconnects the plasma knife, somehow attaches it to one of the jetpack thrusters, and then launches it at the copter like a knife-based missile. So, how did he attach the knife to it? How can its plasma effect work when disconnected from the suit, which I would assume was the power source? And then how does the thruster manage to fly in a perfectly straight line to the helicopter? How does it disconnect from its partner, actually? The jetpacks are shown as one pack unit that is then additionally attached to Curtis's back, so they just have a separation ability. I'm willing to believe all of these things. I'm willing to believe that this level of technology is possible. If you've got an armored battlesuit, like, goddamn, show Curtis duct taping that knife to his thruster. I'll flooping believe that, and then have Curtis say, "Pop, guide the thruster into the helicopter." Boom, you're done. Easy, makes sense, completely explainable. There was also an ever-shifting amount of age in people's faces. Depending on which panel of the comic you're looking at, Edwin Alva could look like a handsome 40-year-old man, or he could look like a much older 65-year-old man who's just all scrunched up and lined. Curtis could be anywhere between his mid-20s to his 50s, depending on his lifestyle choices. Honestly, it is impossible for me to tell if that's from Cowan's pencils or Sienkiewicz's inks, though. Sienkiewicz uses a relatively light touch with his inking. There's really only one line weight in the whole book, making everything look a little bit thin and reedy, and the lines look like they were done with like a feathered pen. They're very scratchy, very rough. I honestly like the look. It makes the whole book feel rough, like it's rushed and under pressure, which really does reflect Curtis's situation very well. That said, there is a lot of dark inks to this. Sienkiewicz is clearly bringing a darker mood to this book than Ivy Draper did to Static. And that's fine. Hardware's situation feels a lot more dire, so I think that the artwork is what really brings that idea home for me. Sotomayor's colors are fairly realistic, focusing mostly on darker blacks and grays, again, that darker tone, with bursts of color from things like explosions or energy effects. The colors are probably the best part of the book overall, just in terms of consistency. Every page looks really well colored, and they are easily the most coherent thing in it. I do think that this is a pretty good first issue in terms of communicating who Hardware is, why he is on the run, and giving us an enemy to fight against. But it is a bit of a mess, conceptually speaking, although we'll see if that matters going forward. We've got 5 more issues to go. Maybe they can pull something out of their butt. Issue 2 has 2 stories running for about half the length of the comic before they end up running into each other. The first one is that of a young kid named Deacon. Deacon lives in an apartment with his dad, and it was on his street that, I think, Hardware crashed one of the helicopters. Deacon and his father are both looking out the window, and his father smiles quietly, glad to see someone sticking it to the Dakota PD. Deacon, meanwhile, is clearly entranced with the idea of a black hero that can stand up to the police. He can clearly recall what Hardware looked like, and he doodles him at school that day. That lack of attention earns him a detention, his teacher commenting that she didn't see a hero when she looked at that man. Deacon texts his dad to pick him up late. Meanwhile, Curtis disguises himself as an FBI agent and sneaks into Alva Industries. Remember when I said that I didn't understand how the hierarchy of villains works here? Apparently, neither do the villains, as the man they are hunting walks into their crime scene with a fake beard and they all just shrug. And despite all of their training, Curtis is actually spotted and recognized by one of his co-workers, Tiffany Evans, his protege. She climbs into the elevator with him and offers to help him. He's reluctant, but he seems to agree after they argue for a bit. Curtis needs to get something from Alva's office so that he can make a deal with Asher Sim, Alva's old partner, and perhaps the only person in the world who has the resources to help Curtis. While Tiffany distracts Alva, making some small talk about Curtis's situation, Curtis plants a bomb? I'm guessing that he does this to draw attention away from Alva's office, because then he sneaks into Alva's office, but instead of stealing whatever it was that he was planning to steal, he uses a watch-like device to initiate a system purge. This wipes the system of, I don't know what, but somebody in the room who shouldn't have been in the room because they were dealing with the bomb, but somebody in the room spots Curtis, recognizes him now, and shouts for him to stop. So he jumps out of the window into his waiting armor. You know, like that scene in Iron Man 3's climax during the big fight scene when he's jumping from suit to suit to suit. Yeah, it's like that, but with one suit. Tiffany, for her part, gets captured. Alva knew that there was something going on between her and Curtis. It was the way that he said her name. Why, Edwin practically raised Curtis. Did you think he couldn't tell when the boy was in love? Unfortunately for Tiffany, this makes her the perfect bait. If she's in danger, he'll come running, right? So she's taken into FBI custody. Curtis learns of this later. I'm assuming through the news, he's shown looking at his phone and then saying, "They got Tiffany." So I'm assuming that they did some kind of broadcast intentionally in order to draw Curtis in. We are then shown Hardware getting shot at in the street. I'm guessing here that he is going to rescue her, but the attack on him ends up being just too much. Hardware gets blasted into a car, which in turn gets knocked into a building. The occupants of the car, or one of them anyway, start screaming. Deacon's dad did indeed pick him up late from detention, and now he is lying in his father's lap, bleeding. Hardware tears the door off of the car and orders Pop to scan the body. As he does, the police close in and surround him, shouting for him to surrender or they'll open fire again. Many of the officers are eager to start shooting, eager to pay Hardware back for their fellows that he's hurt. But what do? Shoot and kill the bystanders? Do they even know that they're there? Do they care? It's hard to tell in the scene, as the focus is really on upping the tension. Hardware can't move from the car without opening Deacon and his dad up to potential gunfire. But if he doesn't flee now, there's a good chance that he gets arrested here. They close in, and finally Pop picks up life signs from Deacon's wounded body. Thank God. Hardware scoops up the kid, plots a course for the nearest hospital, and orders Pop to dump every ounce of power that they have into the jet boots. As the cops open fire, he shouts that if they stop him, they'll be the ones killing this kid. And if that happens, he will kill every one of them. None of the cops move. Hardware flies Deacon to safety, promising his father that he'll find him. Later that night, we go to the house of Baraki Young, who, every time I read her name, I want to pronounce it like Baraka from Mortal Kombat. Especially there's one song, Baraka's track, on the Mortal Kombat 10 soundtrack, where once it opens up, there's like a narrator, and he just says, Baraka. And every time I read Baraki, I go, Baraki. Anyway, Baraki's a professor of law, and when she finds a strange man in her house, she draws her pistol and shoots at him. Thankfully for Curtis, his inertia absorbers in his armor were enough to handle the load. He is also low-dead, as in drunk. Curtis is basically an emotional mess here. He thought that this situation was just between him and Alva, like the two of them in a ring, and that they were just going to hit each other until one of them fell down. But Tiffany has been arrested, Deacon got hurt because of him, it's all his fault. He says that he can't endanger anyone else in this. Baraki doesn't quite know what Curtis is going on about, but she disagrees. She knows that he wouldn't hurt anyone by choice, and that he can't run from this. She is a law professor. They can challenge Tiffany's arrest, maybe help her in court. They need to focus on clearing Curtis's name. That's what's going to save them all. But Curtis is stubborn, and he doesn't want to see anyone else hurt. So, he rockets off. Hardware has Pop plot an intercept course for a passenger plane. As he shoots into the sky, Curtis checks his messages from Virgil Hawkins. our good friend Static. He's got a bunch of voicemail messages, which he deletes, and then he leaves one for the kid. He warns him to stay away from him for now, and not to go to that lab that he told him about, referencing the lab that Virgil raided in Static Issue 2. He tells the kid to just hang on and be good. Finally reaching the appropriate height, maxing out his suit's propulsion systems, Hardware manages to grab onto the little back wings of a passenger plane, and he just lets it take him away. This issue in particular really hits home how dangerous Curtis's situation is. We barely get to know any of the characters that are affected here. We know that Curtis is Tiffany's mentor within Alva Industries. We know that apparently they're in a relationship. We know that Deacon saw Hardware as a hero, and that Baraki, who appears to be a former flame of Curtis, might not be in love with him anymore, but she does care for him enough to want to help him. We barely get to know them, but we know enough to see that their loss or inconvenience weighs heavily on Curtis. Even this is a nice twist on a superhero story. Normally we see heroes go after bad guys with little thought to consequences, to be quite honest. When Curtis tries to get one up on Alva, he escapes, but it costs Tiffany instead of Curtis. He tried to rescue Tiffany, but going out in public gets him attacked, and again, he does manage to survive, but now a little kid is almost killed. What harm could his visit to Baraki cost her? Or his connection to Virgil? Alva is already actively ruining Curtis's life. How many more people could be hurt in the crossfire? Curtis might be protected in an advanced suit of armor and technology, but no one else in this comic book is. That is some good floopin' steaks! And it forces Curtis to further distance himself from allies, which, I'll admit, is a bit off message, given that he was already planning to visit Asher Sim, and he's going to visit Asher Sim, so that is another person that Alva could threaten, but okay, sure, I'll buy it, I guess. Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do, even if you don't want to do it. That's fine. I was initially annoyed at Deacon's inclusion in this comic when I first read it, because I was really getting some serious Darius flashbacks, you know. Why was this kid here? What's his connection to Curtis? Oh, there is no connection? He's just a kid who saw Hardware last night? Great, get him the no swearing out of this comic book. But then they did get him the no swearing out of this comic book, and I felt really bad. And more importantly, I liked the scene shown with him at his school. Deacon is fascinated by Hardware for a number of reasons, many of which are portrayed really subtly within the story. First is that he is a black man who is standing up to authority, an act which could, and has, gotten a black person killed in America. We don't see Deacon vocalize this idea, rather, it's his father who does it for us when he scoffs at the police the next morning. Then, when he is drawing Hardware in class, his teacher says that she doesn't see a hero when she looks at him. His teacher can't imagine that Curtis is an innocent man. She can't imagine that the police are wrong, or that they're being manipulated. Curtis is a man breaking the law, and so he must be stopped. He isn't a hero as far as she's concerned. He never could be. But in the African American community, stories of wrongful convictions are plenty and powerful. According to a 2021 report from the National Registry of Exonerations, about half of all murder convictions are later found to be wrongful. 51% of the people found guilty of nonviolent crimes were later exonerated. Over 100 of the exonerations involved official misconduct. And despite making up about 13% of the American population, African Americans made up a majority of innocent defendants who were wrongfully convicted and later exonerated. Curtis is a black man defending himself from rich, powerful, corrupt men. To someone like Deacon, who has grown up watching people who look like him get arrested wrongfully for crimes or killed by the people doing the arresting, somebody like Curtis Metcalf is a hero. As much as I enjoy all of that subtext, the story of getting there is really rough. I complained that our first issue was lacking in some foundations, like exactly how Alva and the FBI are interacting with each other. That complaint continues here, and Thomas continues to use smash cuts to tell the story. A smash cut, by the way, is when a story jumps from one scene, setting, or time period to another without establishing any context for why we are moving on or how it connects to the previous scene. For example, we jump between Curtis's story and Deacon's story throughout the issue, and let me tell you, it is jarring AF. Especially with Cowan and Sienkiewicz failing to draw the same face twice, or giving us any kind of context for what we're suddenly seeing when we switch between scenes. We see a Alva publicity denouncement of the FBI's investigation, then we smash cut to Tiffany spotting Curtis with no idea who Tiffany is, or that the dude in the FBI uniform was Curtis with a plan. And then after Tiffany sells Curtis on cooperation, we smash cut to her talking to Alva, then smash cut to Curtis walking down a hallway, smash cut to Curtis, smash cut to Tiffany, explosion, Tiffany, Curtis system wiping, someone off panel shouting at Curtis, him fleeing, jumping in the suit, and he flies away. It's clearly structured to create a sense of tension, right? As we aren't given any scene long enough to really get comfortable with the situation. But I have so little of an idea of what is going on that there's no tension in this scene for me, just confusion. Especially when Curtis told us that he was planning to steal something, and then he didn't even try to steal something. He did a system wipe instead. What was he wiping? What was the intent here? Was he just trying to destroy all of his inventions? Alva's whole system? Something in particular? Like, are you really telling me that this $1 million corporation doesn't keep files backed up somewhere, like, I don't know, the cloud maybe? There are tons of stories of massive companies failing to upgrade their systems with the times. That's a very real-world thing, and I get that, and I would like the idea that Curtis is taking advantage of that weakness in their systems, but none of that is told to us, or established, or demonstrated at all. There has to be something to this company than just this one computer. So I'm not in love with author Brandon Thomas's style of writing. I do really enjoy his character work so far. It is much more subtle than the work done in Static, but that's okay because it's still present. I like the overall story that he has crafted. Again, the pieces are all here. But everything is just getting slammed together super fast and with little to no context for understanding. Looking at his bibliography, Thomas has a pretty good comic history. I've heard good things about the Image comic Horizon. I've actually got a digital copy of the trade paperback waiting in my Comixology library. He's done quite a few indie books, I'll admit, none of which I've read, and he's done a handful of Batman comics. He's clearly got some writing chops, so maybe I just need to get used to his style. Oh, one last thing before we go. I loved seeing the phone call from Static Issue 2 referenced here, but the timing of it is very weird. We are told in Static Issue 1 that a month has passed since the Big Bang that gave Static his powers. But Curtis's story appears to start on the day of the Big Bang. We are shown him watching the news at Alva Industries and Milestone returns. He goes to his secret lab after that scene, gets armored up, and then we pick up that story in Hardware Issue 1. A month could not have passed. Curtis also references getting a bunch of phone calls from Virgil, which is honestly what I wanted to see from Virgil in his own comic, but we are never shown that happening in Static. We saw one phone call, and Virgil never gets Curtis's message warning him away from the satellite lab, nor is it explained why Virgil didn't get that message, or if he listened to it and ignored it, or maybe he'd already gone to the lab and then listened to the message and he was just like, well, sorry, Mr. Metcalf, what can you do? And they just keep missing each other by phone. I'm willing to buy that things happened off-panel. That's a pretty common shorthand in comic books. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but I at least need to see it referenced. Virgil never tells us that he has been calling Curtis over and over. He literally just calls the one time, and he doesn't say anything about making multiple calls. Even when he does the one call, he is very wary of doing so, hoping that he's not going to be bothering Curtis. I appreciate the attempt to tie these two books together and create a cohesive shared universe between them. But these puzzle pieces are not lining up properly, and they are not making a very pretty picture. I said going into these Milestone episodes that I was going to cover a whole season per episode. But as I wrote this episode, I just kept tripping over my own feet, y'all. I couldn't seem to condense the story enough, and the more that I condensed it, the less that I could say, and the less that I could say, well, the less that it was a breakdown. It was just a summary. And even then, I don't think that I could have covered all 6 issues in about an hour. Honestly, I was already miffed that the Returns episode and Static episode ran as long as they did. I don't want to make these episodes a slog to listen to, right? So screw it, says I. This book is yearning to get a proper breakdown, and, well, that's what I'm going to do. Next week, we'll continue the adventures of Hardware as he travels the globe in search of an ally. But allies back home aren't content to sit around and wait for him to save them, either. Join me in a week for episode 22.4 of Comic Book Breakdown, The Enemy of My Enemy. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.